So, hi everyone, thank you for joining us. My name is Rachel Behar. I am the digital marketing specialist here at Mahoney Performance Institute. Just a few housekeeping logistic things before we get into our session today. So we are here for an hour together to talk about becoming an HR Ghostbuster. As Stephen goes through his presentation today, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature or the chat. We all have access to that, so we'll be moderating that throughout the presentation and can answer questions as they come up. We also have a really good amount of time on the back end of the session today to make sure that everybody's questions are answered, and we can share our contact information as well in case there's anything that we aren't able to get to. Otherwise, I'm here joined by my colleague, Bruce Parsons. Bruce, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Bruce Parsons from MPI. I'm a principal consultant with the organization and very happy to be with everybody today. Rachel and I attended the New York State SHRM conference in September, and Stephen was one of the guest speakers there, and he spoke on I think the topic was the hiring tree, and we were candidly really engaged and amazed at what we learned in that session, and watched the other people in the audience feeling the same way. And it was a great experience. And we came back here, and immediately I had an HR peer group, I think the next day, and I interrupted what I was going to share with them for the content that day and just supplemented with what I learned from Stephen. And I can't tell you how great the response was. And I decided to share it with every peer group that I had and all our major customers, because it was such powerful information, especially with the challenge people are having with hiring people today and with the labor shortage we have. So Rachel and I just decided to reach out to Stephen and see if he would do something like this with us. And he was very kind in offering to do so. And we welcome him to join us today. And we think all of you will be, this will be a very interesting and engaging conversation that will resonate with almost all of you, or hopefully all of you. But with that, Stephen, please get going here, and let's hear what you have to say about ghost busting.
Yeah, let's do this. So I absolutely love the New York show, by the way, because I think that was one of the more engaged crowds I've ever had. Minnesota was another one, but New York, you guys basically took the cake on that one. So well, cool. I'll do just kind of a brief introduction of myself. So my name is Steve Smith. I am SHRM CP and PHR certified. I actually consult with thousands of companies across the country on hiring practices. I mean, that's kind of my area of expertise. I am the chief hiring expert for Applicant Pro. I've been in this world for about 18 years. The only reason I bring this up with the applicants is as an organization. So Applicant Pro is an applicant tracking software platform. And we deal with about 2.5 million applicants a month. And when you deal with that many applicants, you have a unique opportunity to ask them questions and poll them and find out what it is that they're frustrated about during the application process. And so some of the data that we're going to talk about today stems from those conversations with these applicants, as well as obviously a few employers that I've done some tests with as well. So that's my LinkedIn hiring expert, Steve. So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, you're welcome to. But with that being said, here's a little bit about me. As I mentioned, I do work for Applicant Pro. I actually helped start the company back in 2008. We've been on the Inc. 5000 list now 10 years in a row. We have a little over 11,000 clients, just under 300 employees. And I am currently, for those of you who are familiar with SHRM, I am actually the Utah SHRM State Director. And so, as many of you know, when you deal with volunteer stuff, it's a lot of work, and being the state director is a lot of fun. In fact, getting ready for the RCBM here in February. So we're excited about that. That's a little bit about me. Wanted to bring this article up before we kind of jump into ghosting. So I have a friend that works for Gallup, and he always shares articles with me and is always sharing information with me. And this was an article that kind of struck me as 2022 started coming up. And I usually use this in my hiring tree presentation as well. But one of the things that really struck me is what you can see here that's underlined. A lot of companies are being forced to make what they call long overdue changes to their hiring and retention strategies. And let's be honest, part of hiring and retention does include this ghosting concept. So what is ghosting? Well, think about it. Ghosting is when you are trying to reach an applicant, and there's different levels of this, because there's three areas where they'll ghost you. They'll either ghost you up front. So they apply for the position and then you try to reach out and then they just never respond. Then they also ghost you during the potential interview process. So you have a scheduled interview or something of that nature, a phone screen or what have you, and they just simply don't show up. They literally disappear off the face of the planet. In the Harry Potter world, they would call it disapparation. They completely disapparate on you. And then the third type is actually at the interview stage or even at the point of, they become employed by you, and then suddenly they just don't show up to work one day. And it's like this mysterious thing. So how many of you have been ghosted? This is a rhetorical question, but obviously if you're here, you probably are dealing with this issue. And here's some of the frustrations that kind of come with that. It's hard to fill open positions. Obviously, the bottom line of your business can be hurting. It's very pressure oriented, because for those of you who are in the recruiting side of things and actually trying to fill those open positions, when you don't have people show up, it's embarrassing. It's frustrating for you. It's frustrating for the manager who might be involved in the interview process. And so there's just this feeling of defeat and discouragement. So the question is, who's to blame? Whose fault is it that this ghosting has happened? And in fact, in a lot of the statistics that we've been running, and I work for, I do some side things for some recruiting firms. Right now, ghosting is almost upwards of 28%. That is the highest we've ever seen it. This is the third recession that I've been in since 2005. And that is by far the highest we have ever seen ghosting. The problem is what we oftentimes hear is, oh, well, it's this new generation, or it's these types of applicants. What happens is managers and even we ourselves start blaming the applicants. We start blaming the external factors, COVID, things of that nature. And the problem with that, and I love this quote by Robert Anthony, is when you start pointing all the blame on other people, you really give up your own power to make a change. And I talk about this a little bit in my book, The Hiring Tree, because this is actually one of the chapters in my book. It's important to understand that ghosting, there are elements of ghosting that we can actually mitigate by just making some simple changes. So the question is, have you ever ghosted an applicant? And most employers, it's funny when I ask this, about 80% of employers will say, well, no, I've never ghosted an applicant. But think about it. When was the last time an applicant applied for an open position and you didn't even take the time to send a rejection letter? Guys, this ghosting, you ghosted them. They never heard back from you. You didn't even take the time to send a rejection notice, even though they weren't qualified. And so it's important to understand that there's two sides to this equation. So what we're going to talk about today is not being like E.T. For those of you who are familiar with E.T., if you recall, Elliot kind of takes a little Reese's Pieces and he makes this path from the shed to the house to try to coax him to come into the house. And sometimes we act like E.T. We have these little Reese's Pieces, but then for some reason along the way, we just stop leaving the Reese's Pieces. And then the candidates literally doesn't know what to do at that point. And sometimes we feel the same way. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the first element that typically will lead to ghosting, and that is your application process. And now I'm just going to very briefly cover this. So the first thing is mobile friendly. If your application process is not mobile friendly, you might have people ghosting you before you even see their application. They might be abandoning the process before you even get a chance to even know that they were there. And so this is extremely important. So when you think about your application process, just know that if your process currently is not mobile friendly, you're actually already getting ghosted and you don't even know it. The second piece is the time commitment. So, nowadays, applicants treat the application process kind of like a dating app. If you think about dating apps, when you're on a dating app, you have two options. You can either swipe left or swipe right. And so swiping right is the match, right? Well, applicants treat the application process very much like dating apps today. They just want to swipe right, make it quick, this quick apply. And so what we have found in our studies is that first of all, our clients on average, the application is about 3 minutes. Once you hit about 4.5 to 5 minutes on your application, for every extra minute it takes an applicant to finish that application, you will see a 50% drop off. That's important to understand, because if your application is literally more than about 3.5 to 4 minutes, then you're going to start seeing a drop off of applications that you don't even know that you're missing. And so that's extremely important. So the time factor when it comes to applying is really critical. The last one here, this little loop thing that you see is known as a redirect. So a lot of applications, especially with some of the major job boards like Indeed, ZipRecruiter, Glassdoor, LinkedIn, et cetera, it functions via redirect. So when an applicant finds your ad online and they click to apply, it redirects them to your ATS, it redirects them to your website, or wherever it redirects them to. And did you know that when it gets redirected like that, you actually lose about 76% of your applicants? Because in the redirect, what happens is the applicant has to basically start over. With an easy apply function or a quick apply function, the applicant can use their profile to apply. So it's known as a quick apply or easy apply. And profile parsing is very quickly replacing resume parsing. So resume parsing is where it parses the resume information, so it makes it easy for them to apply. It just takes all the resume information. It's only about 80% accurate at any given time because it depends on how the applicant created the resume. But profile parsing works 100% of the time. And so if in your application process it's not mobile friendly, if you're not allowing this easy apply integration where they can use their profile to apply, or it takes them longer than about 4 minutes to submit the application, you're already scaring applicants away. And like I said, these are the applicants. This is kind of what we call the lost opportunity cost, because you are losing applicants that you don't even realize you're losing. So that is the first area of ghosting that you kind of have to look at are there elements of my application process that is limiting my ability to attract some of these applicants? So part of this, you do need to look at the job seeker persona. You're going to hear me say this a lot. Recruiting is marketing, guys. When I was a recruiter, I used to report to the marketing team. In fact, back then, recruiting wasn't in the HR department at all. I mean, I dealt with HR once we got to the point of hire, but I actually reported to the marketing team all the time. And we would develop these ads and things like that. So you really have to think about the applicant. You know, most of them are employed right now. Think about what that means when you're advertising your positions, when you're having interviews with them. Think about what that actually means. If most of them are already employed, then it behooves you to kind of treat that process maybe differently than you currently are. There is a lot of chaos and uncertainty, so sometimes applicants are a little hesitant to switch their career paths. And so what kind of career path are they looking for? What do they actually want? And more importantly, when you have that initial conversation with them, even at the job ad phase, is there this sense of excitement to work for you? And you know, one of the biggest mistakes that we see, I'm going to bring up this question, what kind of job ads do you actually currently use? See, one of the biggest challenges is 80%. So last year I was in, I think, 28 different states doing a lot of these presentations across the country. And it turns out that over 80, I think it was 82% thereabouts of employers admitted that they just simply use their job description as their job ad. Well, think about that for just a moment. If you're using your job description as your job ad, is there anything exciting about your job description? Right? I mean, think about what that means. You know, this is literally the opportunity as an employer. Your first impression with a job applicant is the job ad. And if all you're doing is using your job description as the job ad, what kind of impression is that really leaving, right? And so it's kind of important to understand that concept. And so when you think about a job seeker, if we look at it from a marketing perspective, a job seeker wants to know what's in it for them. And the problem with a job description is oftentimes it doesn't even cover these requirements right here. So how many of your job ads today include the work schedule? Did you know the number one thing an applicant wants to know right now when they're looking for work is what is the work schedule, which includes hybrid, includes remote. But think about it. You're competing with their personal life. You're competing with other jobs they might have. You're competing with their kids, or maybe they don't have kids or they're trying to have kids. Maybe you're competing with health. Maybe you're competing with school. There's a lot of things that your job is competing with. And when you're competing with those things, that's why one of the first things an applicant wants to know is, well, what is the schedule? And if you're not including schedule in your job ads, you're missing out, because some applicants are going to ghost you right then and there because they're like, well, I don't even know, is this full-time? Is it part-time? What are the typical hours? Like, what does that look like? Pay structure is also really critical. I know in New York, there's now a new law that they're passing where it is required by law to include the pay. Colorado is the same, Washington State, Oregon, there's quite a few states that are starting to pass these laws. But did you know that Indeed back in July and pretty much between July and October, it is now part of their algorithm. So if your jobs are on Indeed right now, when you don't include pay, their algorithm will actually de-rank you. And they'll make it so that you don't rank as well, which means you get less visibility. And so they've already decided to implement the pay structure. So if you don't include pay in your ads right now, you're actually losing out on quite a few applicants. So just as a heads up, that's just kind of a bonus thing, by the way, because that doesn't have a lot to do with ghosting. But yeah, talking about your benefits, the requirements and preferences, again, when an applicant is reading your job ad, this is your opportunity to create this feeling of excitement. Because think about it. If I read your job description, if I even got through it, and then I applied for your company, when you actually call me for the phone screen or the phone interview, or we kind of start that process, if I wasn't really excited about that in the first place, how do you think that phone conversation is going to go? It's like the dating app again, right? I swipe right to match, and then we get on the phone and I'm like, ooh, I'm glad we just did coffee because I'm not sure about this relationship, right? And so this is important to understand. So your job ad is your first opportunity. I can't emphasize that enough. If you want to help mitigate some of the ghosting issues that are already happening, then you need to look at your job ads and make sure that your application process and the length of the application and your ads themselves are really selling the idea of what's in it for them. Why should they work for you? And more importantly, why is what you offer better than where they might be at currently? That's huge. And in fact, in these Gallup polls, because my friend does Gallup, 70% of candidates who are looking for work don't get along with their current supervisor or manager. Well, how often do you see in a job ad that we actually talk about the supervisor or manager they're going to report to for that role? Oftentimes we don't. Honestly, that becomes part of the benefits section. If you can actually address that and think about, well, why would somebody leave their current company? Usually 70% of the time it has to do with that. Why are we not talking about that in our job ads? Maybe have some quotes from employees of what it's like to work for that manager. So anyway, there's a lot of things that you can do at this stage of the process that can really help mitigate ghosting because of that feeling of excitement. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, the last area that we're going to talk about is the interview. And this is where we're actually going to spend a lot of our time, because in our research, this is where we found is where most of the ghosting occurs. And you would be surprised how much of it is actually the employer's fault and not necessarily the candidate's fault. Now, the cool part about this is, now keep in mind, you're not going to mitigate every single ghosting. You're still going to have people that are going to ghost you regardless of what happens. It is what it is. But if we want to mitigate it, think about this question right now. What does it actually feel like to interview for your organization? And more importantly, are your managers actually vested in the process? So we're going to talk about 3 specific areas to kind of help not only separate recruiting from HR, because we don't want this to be HR, we want this to be truly recruiting and marketing. But here are some elements of, first, your managers and your recruiters. One of the biggest things that we noticed, and I actually did a poll with Taco John's and Costa Vida. They're 2 restaurants, huge restaurant chains out here on the West Coast. And I interviewed a lot of their hiring managers and mostly their applicants to understand, well, why is it that you ghosted? Why is it that you left the process? And the number one reason they left was that top little diamond that you see there. During the interview process, or even during the phone screen, that manager was so buried in administrative tasks and processes that there were interruptions. They were interrupted by phone calls. They were interrupted by coworkers just coming to ask questions because they were actually doing the interview in the restaurant, as an example. And I know not all of you are restaurant related, but I just want you to think about this process. They were interrupted by emails. They were interrupted by text messages, like all these interruptions during the actual interview. And all it told the applicant was, well, I must not be important to you. This must not be an important part of your company or organization, because this moment where you're giving me a chance to interview and potentially sell myself as an applicant, well, you're so focused on other business tasks and things that are happening internally in the organization that there's really no focus on me. And what we found is this was happening about 62 to 65% of the time, where there was some type of interruption during the interview process, whether that was a phone screen or the face-to-face type interviews, where this was a distraction. And because there was a distraction in place, it just made for a poor experience for the applicant. So think about that for just a moment. An applicant has a poor experience during the interview process. They interview with another organization that does not have that experience. What do you think is going to happen? When you call back or try to get them in for the second interview or even make an offer, do you think they're going to want to call back? Again, it's like going on a date, and the whole time all the date did was talk about themselves, and you just kind of sat there and listened the whole time and drank your coffee, and then you went home and you're like, never going to meet that one again, right? So just think about your actual interview process, and more particularly the recruiters and hiring managers that are actually conducting the interviews. Because one of the challenges we see is those recruiters and hiring managers are not well trained in the interview process, and they're all over the place. So you need to allow for the interview process to give them a safe place where they can truly focus on the individual that is in the room, even if it's only for 15 minutes to a half hour. That should be the 15 to 30 minutes. I mean, think about it. If this was your child, would you just kind of ignore them, or be distracted by all these other things? Or if your little child is asking you questions, wouldn't you want to sit there and focus on them for just a moment? There's so many things happening around us that this becomes a huge issue. This is by far the number one reason for ghosting. Now, these other three aspects are really important, because sometimes the person that you're putting in that place where they're doing the hiring and interviewing, they're not always the best choice. So those managers need to understand that they are the brand champions of the organization. What does that mean? That manager has to be excited about working for you. That manager has to be excited about the benefits. Like, there has to be this passion behind what they're talking about. So that when they do talk about the company, they're talking about it in such a way that it's like, oh my gosh, I would love to work for this person, or I would love to work for this company. It sounds amazing. Now, you don't want to, give them false information, dangle the carrot, if you will. But these are your brand champions for the organization. And so you want to make sure that you have the right people in place for that type of process. And guess what? This is easily trainable. It's easily trainable. Like in speaking with a lot of companies across the country, sometimes the complaint is, oh, well, I just don't think that manager has the ability to be good at that kind of stuff. Well, guess what? It's trainable. It actually is trainable. It's one of the best parts about this. And Gallup actually proved that. They had a really good article on this that my friend shared with me, that it is trainable. So just find ways to train them. And I know the Mahoney Institute, you guys have options for that, don't you, Rachel? Right? So this is a great opportunity to say, okay, we have this partnership and this organization that we can actually turn to receive some of that training that some of our recruiting and hiring managers are going to need. Now, how many of you are familiar with Bob Ross? My daughter, when she was 13, was really struggling in school. And she ran into some YouTube video of Bob Ross back in the 70s teaching somebody how to paint happy little trees. And I can't tell you the impact this had on my daughter. Your hiring managers and recruiting managers are there to paint the little happy trees, right? They need to be able to paint the picture of what it's like to not only be in the position that they're interviewing for, but what it might actually be like to work for the organization. My daughter loves, and she paints now. She paints all the time, and she has these canvases. It literally changed her life in that sense, because Bob Ross had this ability to sit down and take somebody who has absolutely no skills whatsoever in painting, and literally within a half-hour program, you could paint a happy little tree and be good at it. And he could lead you along in that 30 minutes to that point. And so when your hiring managers and recruiting managers are actually talking with these applicants, are they painting the picture? Are they able to kind of take it from point A to point B, so that at the end of that interview, the candidate's just like, wow, I really got a lot out of this interview? Because if that kind of stuff is not happening, again, the likelihood of ghosting goes up. The last thing is this influence in decision-making. How many times does an applicant ask a question and the manager's like, I'm going to have to get back to you on that? You know what? I don't actually make that decision. I'll have to ask somebody internally later on. More and more, we're seeing that a lot of the recruiters and hiring managers don't have this influence or decision-making power. They just don't have it. And it's amazing, because it's actually a turnoff to the applicants. The applicants see this and they're like, wait a minute, I'm interviewing with you, but you don't have absolutely any influence or decision-making power in this. It almost is weird. It feels weird. And when an applicant is sitting there asking the questions and they're not really getting the answers that they're seeking, that's a problem. And so one of the ways you can mitigate this is to really sit down and think about, well, what are some of the questions that are probably going to be asked the most for this particular position, for the organization itself? And how do we train and help our manager be prepared to answer those questions so that they look like they have an element of influence and decision-making power? this is, I can't emphasize this enough, because when applicants see that, oh wait, you don't even have that influence or decision making power, it's almost sad, because it's like, oh well, why am I even meeting with you then? And so this is an important aspect of this first element of the interview process. These are so crucial, that the people that you have in these roles are the right types of people that can encompass these four diamonds. So hopefully that makes sense. And Rachel, I'm not sure if any questions have come through, but let me know if any comes in that becomes critical, right?
Stephen, can I just interject something here?
Go ahead.
You know, I read a book recently called Talent War, and it complemented what Stephen just shared here extensively, and it really resonated with me. And they talked about some of the best companies today who are doing this are taking some of their best, strongest performers, like those brand champions, like Stephen's talking about, and even separating them from the day-to-day work, and they're focusing on the interview process, and in putting some of their best people in front of the applicants to show them, we care so much about you, we're having you talk to some of our best people. And think of your own selves. If you're a high performer, wouldn't you want to be talking to some of the highest performers in that organization to represent the organization? And it was really interesting to me, because it was so kind of contrary to what I was normally seeing in organizations, where it was, we're leaving it to and I'm not trying to diminish recruiters and hiring managers, but when we have people sitting in front of us who are actually going to be doing the jobs that we're doing or have, and they're some of the highest performers in the organization, and I see myself as a high performer, I can better relate to them, and I see that they have influence and decision making authority and so on. It just makes a big difference, and it just really resonated with me. It so much aligns with what Stephen's saying here.
Yeah. It's so critical. In fact, what you just talked about kind of leads into this ongoing communication piece. One of the biggest challenges a lot of employers face right now is this ongoing communication. Did you know that if you don't have frequent communication with them every 1 to 2 days, you're actually going to lose them? What we have found in the research is that once 2 days goes by, if they have not heard back from you, they start getting paranoid. They start getting anxious. There's these feelings that the applicant starts getting, especially when they actually like your organization. They start getting these anxious feelings, and it's like, well, if they're not going to get back with me, maybe I should just take this other offer, because I now have an offer on the table, right? And when you don't have this ongoing communication with the applicants, you don't know that they have that other offer on the table. But if you have good, clear communication with them, and there's clear expectations up front that this is the interview process and this is what it looks like, it's so much easier for that applicant, especially if they really like you, to call you and say, hey, I just got an offer on the table. I just want you to know. I mean, how many of you have applicants that actually do that? Probably not very often. And it has to do with this communication process. So the first thing is the clear expectations. Now, clear expectations also is internal accountability. And let me explain why. There are two sides to expectations. The first expectations is obviously with the applicant. You need the applicant to understand right away that here's what our interview process looks like. Here's the average time it takes us. Here's what it looks like from point A to point B. You should let them know that up front. Be fully transparent, because the more transparent you are, the less transparent they become in regards to being a ghost, right? You don't want them ghosting you. And so the best way to mitigate that is to have those clear expectations up front. And right now, on average, did you know that most applicants are on and off the market within 14 days? That is the average right now. And in some industries, it's closer to 18 days. But that means you literally have a 2-week window to make your decision. And that's where internal accountability comes into play. What we noticed in our research with a lot of these organizations is that the internal accountability is one of the biggest challenges and issues that an employer faces. Why? Think about how often there is a tug of war between the recruiter in HR and the actual hiring manager. Think about that for just a moment. One of the biggest complaints that recruiters in HR has is, oh, well, the hiring manager is still deciding. Oh, they're still deciding. Oh, they're going to let us know next week. Oh, now they're going to let us know 2 weeks from now. Oh, now, up front, before the interview process even begins, you need to have some type of internal accountability in place with that manager that says, look, manager, when we start bringing these applicants in for an interview, your decision has to be made within the next 14 days. No waiting, no waiting for a better applicant or pushing it off or what have you. If you don't like the applicant, let's just move on. But there needs to be some type of internal accountability with that manager so that that manager also has a clear expectation that this is what we're going to do. That piece I have seen is missing in so many organizations today because they cannot pinpoint and really nail that manager down as to what that clear expectation is. And so I want you to really think about that. Clear expectations is definitely important for the applicant, but it's even more important for the manager and those that are actually involved in the interview process because of this internal accountability. And unfortunately, there are enough organizations that are not holding their internal managers accountable like they should. And when you don't do that, you start getting this delay, and it feels like the Reese's Pieces from ET, where we're just putting another Reese's Pieces down. And so the recruiter has to call the applicant again and say, we're still waiting. It's going to be another 2 days. Think about what that does. That is so extremely deflating. Why would the applicant want to stick around? Okay, so clear expectations and that internal accountability are interchangeable, and they really need to be happening. Frequent communication is also key. I talked about that. Every 2 days or so, you want to have some type of communication, even if it's just, hey, we loved your interview, we enjoyed it. We're just waiting on our manager. I just wanted to do a touch point with you, let you know that we're really excited about this. Some type of communication that lets them know. And by golly, if you are not going to move forward with them, cut it off quickly. Don't string them along. One of the most frustrating aspects for an applicant is when the company just kind of strings them along over this period of time for so many weeks sometimes, and there's no real true communication that, oh, well, it turns out you've been number 2 this whole time, and so now we're not moving forward with you. Because not only does that leave a bad impression, but think about how it works today. How often can applicants go online and leave a review about your company? It happens all the time. You can't change those reviews. You can't call Indeed or Glassdoor or whatever and say, hey, can you remove that review for us? They're not going to do that. That's just not how it works. And so even if you are rejecting people, this frequent communication is so critical. Now, the last thing actually alludes to what Bruce just mentioned about show and tell. If you have people in your organization that are like the all-stars or the really solid people in that role currently, why would you not want to introduce them during the interview process to that individual? Have them show and tell and talk about the organization. Sometimes your hiring manager or recruiter can't really talk to that position as well as the person who's actually in the job. And so that's where show and tell comes into place. And that is part of communication, communicating and being fully transparent as to what the role actually entails so that they have a really good idea about what it's like to actually work in the role as well as the organization. And that's so important because sometimes we really don't focus on the impact that position has in the company. Think about when a candidate comes and interviews with you, do they actually know how important that role is? At the end of that interview, do they realize that, wow, without that role, this company actually will struggle in these areas? Why not be fully transparent about that? Why not talk about that? This is part of our show and tell. This is why you are important to us, because this role fulfills this for the company, which big picture gives us this, right? You can kind of paint the picture again, and that's part of that process with show and tell. So I can't emphasize enough how important this ongoing communication is. Here's something that's really cool. And again, I talk about Gallup a lot because I really appreciate the types of statistics and data that they provide. But this is what they said, and this was just recent. In fact, this is also a quote in my book. Individualized information is important to everyone, but it's really important to millennials. More so than any other generation, millennials need to be in the loop about their day-to-day work and their part in the organization and how they contribute to the purpose and where the company is headed. This is all about impact. If these are things that you're not talking about in your interviews, especially with some of the younger generation, you're missing out on a solid opportunity to really help them see the big picture and how they fit within that picture. So this individualized information is so crucial for these younger generations. And I'll tell you what, we can complain that, oh, this generation is lackadaisical and they're lazy or entitled or whatever we want to say. But the reality is when you were that age, didn't you have some similar thoughts and aspirations? We all had aspirations at that age. We're not that age anymore, so we don't always remember. But if we sit back for a moment and we look back, I work with a lot of college kids. I love working with the college students because they remind me of what I once was. And that's okay. It's okay to have those aspirations and be a little bit different. We just have to approach it differently. And so talking about these things is so crucial. Okay, so the last piece is the leadership, and are they fully vested in the interview process and actually hiring somebody? How many of you have somebody say, hey, we have this position to fill, and then they, oh, change their minds? This is really hard, and it's not always controllable. Let's be honest, you can't always control that aspect because sometimes things happen in the organization that suddenly causes a change. Today, this morning, literally, my company had a flood. Well, guess what? It completely changed the way everybody had to do their work today. And now I have literally one of my coworkers is they're doing a live Facebook feed to our employees to let them know what's happening, right? So there's just random things that can always happen during the process. And so we just have to be able to be prepared for stuff like that. These 4 diamonds are the last piece of it, and it's so important. If you are interviewing, or even a phone screen, if that phone screen and interview is not individualized to that person that you're interviewing, you're going to lose. You're going to lose them. They're going to lose interest. They're going to look for something else. Truly engaged conversation. Now, we're going to talk about engagement here in just a few minutes. It'll be our last slide for this presentation. But really, truly having an engaged conversation, and what does that look like? And we're going to talk about those elements. Rejection feedback. Again, if you are not rejecting people, you need to start rejecting people. It's okay to be a rejecter. Let them go. It's like layoffs. You know, it's got to happen. Just lay it off and get it over with. It's happening right now. So don't be afraid to reject them. But I will promise you that if you do reject, it leaves a much better taste in the mouth of the applicant than when you don't reject them. Because when you don't reject them, guess what you just did? You ghosted them. Isn't that what you're trying to mitigate in the first place? So just think about that. And then obviously this care and value. It amazes me how many organizations do not have core values or a mission statement to define who they are as an organization. And when they do, for some reason, they don't talk about it during the interview process. Why would you not talk about that? Part of your organization, this is who you are. When you have core values and a mission statement as to who you are as an organization, that is part of who you are. Don't you want those applicants to be able to kind of buy into that and also be part of the organization? So really taking care and valuing what is already valuable to you as an organization and to the employees that work for the organization. If your employees don't have your core values and mission statement memorized, you're not doing it right. I'll tell you right now, because the only way we can truly live a core value is if we know what those core values are in the first place. And sometimes memorizing it helps, but also talking about those core values constantly and really coming from leadership from the top down is one of the best ways to do that. Okay, so in our last 5 minutes, as we prepare for our Q&A, let's talk about what manager engagement looks like. This is such a cool concept because when Gallup was doing some of these polls and in some of my own research and talking with applicants, it amazes me how the traditional focus has changed to what we call an engaged focus. So the traditional focus is, oh, it's all about the paycheck. We're week to week, we're just getting a paycheck. But the reality is a lot of these, especially newer generation, and even my generation, that kind of this middle ground right now, it's not about the paycheck anymore. Yes, the paycheck helps us pay bills, and it's still important. But our focus is not so much on the paycheck as it is on my purpose in the organization. What is my purpose here? What is the impact that I'm having? How does it relate to the whole, right? And when somebody understands their purpose, the paycheck will speak for itself, and satisfaction with their pay will be there because their purpose outweighs that. And so if instead of this traditional focus on maybe we should pay more, like a lot of companies right now are looking, oh, maybe we should pay more. Maybe we should pay more. Maybe we should pay more. That is not always the right answer. Sometimes paying more doesn't fix the problem because the problem is not the paycheck. The problem is they don't understand their true purpose in the organization. So just think about what that means. Satisfaction, like we do these satisfaction surveys, and are you satisfied working with us? I see this all the time. It's not about satisfaction anymore. What they want to know is, am I developing myself? Am I increasing my capacity to do more? Am I am I doing more? Is what I'm doing making an impact on the organization, which kind of goes back to purpose? But are they growing? Is their capacity growing? When was the last time you had a conversation with some of your employees and you actually know what they want to do with their life? And they've kind of talked about, oh, I would love to be able to do such and such. And do we have something internally as an organization that can kind of help facilitate that? This next one is one of the biggest kickers, and I love this one. It is no longer about being a boss. We all have had bosses in our life, right? But I want you to think about this in a sports analogy. How many of you have played sports back in the day? I used to play baseball, and I can tell you right now that there was a big difference between my coach that just kind of yelled at me all the time. So you need to do this, you need to do that. Why can't you correct this? Why can't you correct that? As opposed to the coach who actually took the time and sat down with me and said, you know, Steve, you missed this today. And here's why you missed it. I think if we adjusted this setting or the way you swung or the timing, I think we could fix this issue. And so they sit down with me, we go into the batting cage, we went through this process. I can tell you right now that was a true coach, not like a boss with some of my other coaches. That was somebody who was willing to take a look at what was happening and saying, you know what, I think these are some adjustments that we can work on. Let me show you how we've seen others do it, right? So think about in your organization, do you just have a bunch of bosses in the organization, or are you an organization full of coaches that are actually helping and making a difference and really helping the employees themselves see where they fit, but also see where they can make improvements? So it's so important. Annual reviews kind of out the door. Even if you still do annual reviews, which can be helpful, it really is focused more on ongoing conversations. If your boss or coach, if you will, is not having these ongoing conversations with the employees throughout the year, as opposed to just this one time we sit down and have this annual review, you're really missing out. Because a truly engaged focus are these ongoing conversations. How else are you going to really know about that individual anyway? And yes, we want to be careful. We don't want to find out too much about the individual that it becomes a problem, right? Because there's always these legal things. But at the end of the day, guys, we're people. We're all people, right? We all have our families and we have things that we're passionate about, that we're excited about. So these ongoing conversations are so important as part of this manager engagement and being engaged with your employees, as opposed to just being the boss and annual reviews and such. This also goes into weaknesses. You know, sometimes as a boss, you just focus on those weaknesses, like my coach did. The one coach I didn't really like, because all they want to do is say, well, why can't you do this? Why can't you do that? Why don't you do it this way? Why do you do it that way? Why? Like, instead of, it's almost like an interrogation. The coach will look at the strengths and say, you know what, you got this swing really well, but you're missing the timing a little bit. Let's focus on that. And so when we approach it as, hey, here's the strength and the good that I'm seeing, so now let's try to make this little tweak and see if we can't make it better, right? I love the book from Jim Collins, Good to Great, right? Because the reality is we hired that candidate in the first place, so we already thought they were good. So what are we doing in the organization to now make them great? And if all we're focusing on is on weaknesses and not the strengths, we're really missing out on that opportunity. The last thing is the job and the life, which we've kind of alluded to already. Yes, sometimes you have people that simply just go to work because it's their job and they just want to get it done. But what if in our engaged focus, by being a coach, helping them with their development, having these ongoing conversations, that suddenly their job is actually part of their life? I have a job, right? But this is also my life. I am absolutely passionate and I love everything about hiring. Even when it's hard, I love it because it has now become a part of my life, because I know that I can help organizations across the country just be better at it. And so it becomes part of my life and it's not just a job anymore. And so instead of just getting in and clocking in, okay, here we go, another webinar, another, call, it's no longer a job. This is my life. It's a part of me and it's absolutely fun. And so again, when you think about traditional focus and engaged focus, where do you lie? And are there elements of the traditional focus that you're used to that need some modification? And so this is so important to help mitigate ghosting, because this is the number one reason why employees don't show up, because this really focuses on the employee, not the candidates, right? So just kind of think about that. So we're going to open up for Q&A, just so that you know, and I'll let Bruce talk to this a little bit. There is a free onboarding playbook that you can access. So if you go to the MahoneyPerformanceInstitute.com, You'll be able to download that. They have some great programs that are available to kind of help with some of the trainings that we've talked about today, especially if some of your managers are really struggling and they need help to understand how to be more of a coach and things of that nature. And so we're going to open it up for Q&A. I'll leave this on the screen for just a little bit, Bruce, if you want to chime in now.
Sure. So what we're going to offer all the attendees is a playbook to help you think, to enrich and expand on what you learned today. And we've got two tools to share with you. One is an onboarding checklist, things to think about in the onboarding part of the pipeline of bringing employees in. And then another tool is just a hiring process flow of events that are fully aligned with what you heard today from Stephen. But it's a tool we share with our people in our leadership development training to, because all leaders of others are usually hiring or bringing new team members in at some point in time, and we share ideas with them on how to do that better. But I also want to share that, that last slide that Stephen was showing between the traditional approach and the engaging approach, for those of you who know us, who've worked with us, that right side is very consistent with MPI's approach to leading people in organizations and getting stuff done, is appealing to those things on the right side is what you want to do. And that takes a tremendous amount of purpose and intent in planning and thinking and holding ourselves accountable to do that. But because the easy way and the more traditional way is on the left side, and we know what kind of results that generally gets. So this really resonated with us at MPI. It shows how we're very like-minded thinkers with Stephen and his organization.
Cool. Well, my last selfish plug, I'll just throw this up there and then we'll do Q&A. I do have a book, obviously, called The Hiring Tree. This is actually chapter 13 of that book. It is launching here in 2 weeks, February 2nd. So actually, maybe that's less than 2 weeks now. But if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, or if you prefer Instagram, I also have a Facebook page. You can look up The Hiring Tree. So this is my selfish plug. If you'd like to follow along, you're welcome to. And yeah, let's open it for Q&A. Rachel, I don't know what kind of questions may have come in. I haven't really looked yet. So I'm just going to turn the time over to you. So we can't hear you. I think you're muted. Sorry. I see you talking. I see you trying.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to read the first question off for you. It reads, for manual labor jobs that are physically demanding, their pay is typically a big factor as to why they stick around. We have a great culture here, and we as a company have have made drastic strides to improve retention with these jobs, but sometimes it is still not enough to attract and retain these employees. These specific positions are the number one job in our company that lead to ghosting. Any thoughts on this?
Okay, so one of the first things I would look at are your benefits. What kind of benefits do you offer? And not your traditional. So a lot of companies focus so heavily on, they just look at health, dental, 401k. Have you ever actually talked with your employees to find out if there are any benefits that they might be missing that they would enjoy? Yeah, they might go for more pay, but sometimes the benefits can outweigh the pay if there's a real focus on those benefits. And even more so when those benefits are tailored to the organization. I work with a lot of manufacturing companies in this country. They deal with a lot of blue collar. And so one organization, what they did is they started offering a free lunch every day for their employees. And I'm not saying this is what you have to do, but what they found is that a lot of these people, they just either would forget a sack lunch or they'd have to go out and purchase something or what have you. And so they ended up offering free lunch every day, or at least 3 to 4 times of the week, to kind of help mitigate that so that they didn't have to travel outwards and try to go buy stuff. And it just made it easier for them to say, you know what, I get this benefit every day with this lunch. And so this makes it a lot easier for me. So I'm not having to leave during lunchtime. I don't have to, pack my lunch or prepare for that, or expect my spouse to help me with that or what have you, because there's enough going on in my life. And so sometimes it's a matter of really sitting down with some of your employees and finding out, what is it that you want? Like, what are some things that are really frustrating for you right now? What are some things that you're struggling with? And see if there's some maybe non-traditional benefits that you can start offering that might help mitigate that a little bit. Because you're right, you can't always offer more pay. That's not always the answer. And when they go to that other company, have you ever thought about looking at the reviews for that other company? What are some people saying about working for some of your competitors in the area? Sometimes looking at stuff like that, like if they make complaints about the supervisor or the management team they work with, or if they make complaints about whatever, that might give you some ideas that, oh, well, what if we offered this as a benefit here? So then we can even use that as a tool during our interview process to say, oh, well, unlike some of the competitors around here, you don't want to name them, right? But just say, unlike some of the competitors around here, we do this that's a little bit different from what others do. And it can also help during that interview process. So it's really about that engagement. And I'm glad you're making changes to the culture. So hopefully some of the stuff we talked about here today can help facilitate that even more with the engagement with your culture. And so that's kind of where I would lean. I know it's kind of a generalized answer, but I'd be more than happy to talk offline if you want to talk more in depth, because I have a lot of clients. We could even talk about best practices and things like that. But really, I would focus on benefits more. What is it about your benefits that stand out? And if they don't stand out, maybe that's where you're lacking, not the pay. And so that's something to really think about. And I would also look at those non-traditional benefits. So.
Yeah, Stephen shared a story similar about this topic.
I almost shared it.
It's a good one.
You want me to share it? I can.
I can tell the people who are on this call, there was an audible gasp in the room when Stephen brought this up, and it was very vivid.
Yeah.
And it was a company that had a lot of working women, and they learned that the number one thing that they would like to get is help with cleaning their home. And they decided to provide a once a month reimbursement for home cleaning services. And when Stephen brought this up, the audience was, I would say, 2/3 or more women. There was an audible like holy cow. And it just, and then you mentioned that, the company also looked at things like, providing car detailing services, for example, for men who, anything, things that take time away on the weekend when people want to have free time and they have chores they have to do. If there's some way we can liberate them from that, it's surprising to learn some little things we could do to help people. And you just look different to other organizations by thinking of stuff like that. I thought that was a great story.
That cleaning benefit is by far the number one thing that applicants will bring up during the interview process. Why? Because when our employee gets their house cleaned, they will take a picture, they will post about it, they'll do a live video, look at what happened today, and they kind of show their house and kind of span around their house and such. I can't tell you how effective that has been to produce more employee referrals because of that benefit. And again, that is a non-traditional benefit, but how hard is it to just say, you know what, we're going to provide $100 reimbursement every month for somebody to come in and clean your house so that you don't have to worry about that part of your life, right? Because that's frustrating. And we have 83% of our employees are moms. And a lot of them are divorcees. Some of them, are single homes. Some of them they have family, but it's just it's hard sometimes. So yeah, that's an example of a non-traditional benefit that we offered because we interviewed and talked to our employees. What do you hate the most? And they're like, oh, I come home to a dirty house. I wouldn't have known that otherwise without asking them. And so that's a huge, it's a really good example of that. But that's why I say look at your non-traditional benefits, because you'll be surprised at how often that can help with that.
Stephen, I have another question about the interview process. So you made the point that a candidate is typically on and off the market within a 14-day window. Can you speak to maybe some tips or best practices on how to optimize those 14 days, especially for organizations that maybe like historically have had lengthier interview processes or, conduct group interviews and really want people to come back multiple times? Can you speak to, just some best practices on how to optimize that 2-week window?
That's such a great question. Again, this really goes back to that internal accountability. Because the biggest challenge that we see is that if your manager is not on board with the 2-week window or the 3-week window or whatever window you want to create, you're going to have pushback and you're going to clash that entire time. There's going to be this huge contention. So you first need to set parameters internally. Even let's say that your interview process for sure is 4 weeks. You can't change it. There's nothing you can do about it. Well, then guess what? you need to make sure that the manager is held accountable to the 4 weeks, but you also need to make sure when you're talking with the applicant that they know that this is a 4 week process right up front. And more importantly, keep your promise. If you promise it's a 4 week process, then you better stick to that 4 week process as best as possible. And again, I know things will happen, like the flood we just had at our company today. And quite frankly, my HR team had some interviews they were going to do today. Now it got delayed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So things do happen. But anytime you can hold yourself accountable to a certain window that you know that you can do, then be transparent about it. And when you tell the applicant up front that, hey, this is 4 weeks, guess what you just did? You are now holding yourself accountable, because I promised 4 weeks, I better deliver. And so it's just this semblance of accountability. Write it down, make it, and if you want to improve it, make it your goal to improve it, and maybe look at your process and find ways to improve it. But really, it's all about accountability, personal accountability with the managers, personal accountability with the actual applicants, and then personal accountability with yourself, that you're going to hold those two sides of the party to that. To me, that's the most critical, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, maybe that's difficult to do. I mean, we can talk about some additional best practices there, but I'll tell you what, especially that initial phone screen, if you guys aren't texting, for those of you that are in manufacturing, production, restaurants, retail, if you're not texting applicants initially to bring them in for that first phone screen or the face-to-face interview, you're missing out tremendously, because most of those types of applicants, they don't have a computer at home. The only way they do stuff is on their phone. And so if you're not communicating with them in that way on their phone, you may find that they're ghosting you simply because they're not reading their emails. Think about it. An email on average will get responded to in about 3 days, whereas a text, the average response time is about an hour. So for those of you who are in that field of those high turnover type roles, texting is where it's at, because 98% of them have a cell phone. And that is their only access to the internet, is on their cell phone, because they don't have a computer at home. And they may not even have internet at home. It's their only access to the internet is through their phone. And that's why we talk about mobile friendliness. So making sure that your process is also mobile friendly. Like when you're inviting for an interview or giving them an update, yes, an email is great, but you may also want to send a text and say, hey, check your email. Simple as that. Just a simple text that says, hey, we just sent you an email, wanted to make sure you got it. Mm-hmm. It's all part of that communication process. So that's how I would approach that, for sure.
Awesome. Well, we have, I think, time for one more question, and we have a good one to end on here. So someone writes, we engage with employees almost immediately after they accept the job offer to begin their onboarding process. We connect them in advance of their start date to learn about them, their preferred learning style, what experience they may have with our current system, etc. New hires are often very excited that we ask these things in advance, as it is very unique compared to previous employers. We've had 2 hires ghost us recently on the first day, despite direct connection the day before. Both ghosts were hourly production roles. Is this level of connection perhaps too intense for some roles? Should we adjust our process to accommodate the applicant/role?
Oh, that is such a great question. And the answer is yes, that could be overwhelming. And so again, when you think about your positions, you have to think about where that applicant is coming from. Are we being too forceful, right? Because sometimes in that process, it's almost like we just assume the sale. You know, have you ever gone to a car dealership where they just assume you're there to buy something, and so they sit there and follow you the entire time, and then at the end of it, you're just like, I don't even want to talk to you anymore, much less buy a car from you, because so don't come across as the used car salesman, right? So in your process, if you're noticing that where you do have some people that are ghosting right away, then you're absolutely right. You may want to bear off a little bit, and you may want to and they may not tell you this, but ask some of your current employees, hey, employee, when you went through this process, what did you like or not like about it? Was there parts of it that you felt was overbearing or was too much, or where we were like this helicopter parent? My daughters use this a lot. Dad, don't be a helicopter dad, right? So are we being a helicopter employer, right? Because we don't want to come across as desperate. So that's where you want to really look at this. Are we being desperate by making those adjustments? Or is there kind of a process where it's like, okay, this doesn't feel so desperate, right? So that's what you want to be careful of, is not to come across as desperate or being like a helicopter employer, where that becomes an issue. So that is such a good question, and you're absolutely right. It may have been too much for those candidates. And let's be honest, at the end of the day, some candidates, they already have another offer on the table. And so they just wanted to get another offer so they could kind of see what it was like. And that other offer just trumped it. And so again, you can't stop ghosting 100% at all times. You just can't. So that's the unfortunate part about that, especially with production and manufacturing. Because again, I deal with blue collar people quite a bit. You can't always mitigate that. So if they're willing to talk about it later on, sometimes I'll reach out 2 or 3 months later. Hey, you went through this process with us. We're just looking at this again, wondering, you didn't really show up. Would you be willing to talk about it or let us know? Was it the offer that we made? Was it the hourly wage? Was it the benefits? Was there something amiss in our process that you might be able to help us improve? And some applicants are willing to say, yeah, you know what, it was this. And some, they just ignore you. I mean, you can't avoid that, but it doesn't hurt to ask, because if you don't ask, you can never get an answer. I mean, the worst case is you won't get an answer, right? So yeah, that is an awesome question.
Well, Stephen, I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of our participants here. Like I've heard, this is now my second time hearing this presentation, and I'm still leaving with 2 full pages of notes. So this was really valuable. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. And thank you to everybody who attended for sharing your time with us as well. We know there's a lot of other things you can be doing and working on, but it's always valuable to kind of take a step back from your day-to-day work and, think a little bit more strategically. So Stephen, Bruce, any last final comments before we wrap up here?
I was just going to bring this up real quick. Don't forget the playbook, guys, if you want a playbook. So
yeah, and I'd like to supplement that with, we'd be happy to have a 20-30 minute conversation with anybody who would like to talk about this subject more. At MPI, we're all about helping our clients do better. And even if you're not a client yet, we'd be happy to spend some time with you on the phone or on Zoom just to share ideas with you that we know work. We've got, I didn't have time to share, but we've got a couple real life experiences with people, Stephen, who adopted your job ad placement tool, who did some things about making the application process easier, and saw a near overnight 3x increase in applicants. So this is real stuff, everybody. And we'd be happy to share more with you if you'd like to have a conversation, and just let us know if you would. But I'd like to thank Stephen as well. Wonderful stuff, great information, and hope you all are leaving with at least one thing you're going to start doing differently as a result of what you learned today.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for having me.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
Okay, bye.
Bye.